Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of the Capitalist Corner. I am your host, Mark Pellegrino, and the chairman of the American Capitalist Party, along with my esteemed co-host, Michael Liebowitz, the co-chairman of the American Capitalist Party, and also the host of the great show, The Rational Egoist. Hopefully you saw his debate with our esteemed guest, James Valliant. I'm going to turn this over to you real quick, Michael, because you have a question to pose to our esteemed guest, because we're going to be talking about constitutional legal issues today, and what better person to bring on than an expert in both. So, what's your question, Michael?
So, Jim, you have a unique method of constitutional interpretation that differs slightly from my own, but I still think it's good. And we're going to be asking you questions about the constitutionality of, various policies, laws, what have you. So before we get into that, I think it's important, if you can, and I know I'm asking something very difficult, but can you give us a summary of your view of how the Constitution should be interpreted?
I think it should be interpreted like any other legal document or any other legal languages. And when it comes to the Constitution, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has dropped the ordinary rules that they would apply to, say, interpreting a contract, a will, a statute, and somehow those are suspended in several ways and cases. The Commerce Clause, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, they just get tossed right out the window. The Supreme Court, in the wake of the passage of the 14th Amendment, simply gutted the 14th Amendment. We got Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal is okay under the Equal Protection Clause. That's obviously nonsense. Brown versus Board of Education had to come along to correct that. They gutted the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Now, what's unique about my view, I think, is that I take an objectivist view of concepts to it. That is to say, I don't need to go look up Samuel Johnson's dictionary because they didn't really use dictionaries, frankly, at that time. They were using common ordinary meaning, and that meaning has to be able to include new examples. So, for example, this is well known and this is well established. For example, freedom of the press. They didn't envision radio, television, the internet, but clearly, if I were to take a very strict view, I'd say only print media or spoken words are the press. No. Obviously, we have to expand the things that we include in the concept as that concept expands over time. If it's within the meaning, the broader meaning and intent of the document. And so, for example, I take a broad, and of course, I am a believer in individual rights and the original vision of the framers. And so I take very seriously the 9th and 10th Amendments, which have also been sort of erased out by the Supreme Court as having practically zero meaning. But they only put in italics the importance of using the correct, the classic rules of interpreting legal language. And so I read the powers and the procedures very, very narrowly and strictly. I read the statements about rights very, very broadly, even so broadly as to include stuff that the framers could not have anticipated.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Just so if anybody's curious about the disagreements that Jim and I have, you can go to my podcast, the past episode of The Rational Egoist. Matter of fact, I'll post it with this later on. I'll include it in the description where Jim and I debate this very issue.
You can post that. You are boomer adjacent with technology. I just have to. Okay, glad to hear that. Well, we have a series of articles that came out describing what looks like it is becoming a constitutional crisis with our president, this current administration. The first article we're going to talk about, James, is from the Daily Economy, entitled "Congress Must Take Back Control Over Tariffs." Now, of course, this president has assumed complete control over tariffs by using an emergency act to assume this control. And there's a slight pushback from Congress, but nothing that will really take the power back to the legislator. Now, let's talk about the power of tariffs. Who has the real power of tariffs? Because I think there's probably MAGA people out there very confused about this, simply because executive orders have been issued making these claims. I think they think those are legitimate because the president wants them to be. But this is not the case. The Constitution relegates the power of the purse to the legislature. So tell us what's wrong with what the president is doing right now, aside from causing a worldwide trade war and dumping us into probably a deep recession very soon. What's constitutionally wrong with what he's doing, and how can we fix it?
Well, Article 1 is what defines the powers of Congress. Section 8 is where those powers are specifically delineated and is given to Congress to impose taxes on us. I want to go even further back if I can. You know, one of the big issues in English common law going all the way back to Magna Carta is whether the king could create or increase a new tax. And the founding fathers went to war over a centuries old principle of English law: no taxation without representation. Hundreds of years ago, it became established that the king could not increase or create a new tax without the consent of Parliament. And so taxation without representation is kind of what we're seeing right here. Now, you could say, well, the president is the one who's been elected. No, we don't have direct election of the president. He is elected by the states and by state legislature procedures that they can change and alter under our Constitution. But in any case, we have a strict separation of powers. James Madison was very clear about this. We're adopting the French philosopher Montesquieu's view that judicial, legislative, and executive powers ought to be separated. The president has no rulemaking authority. Now, within the rules that Congress passes, he has a little discretion, obviously. I won't get into the details of that, but that discretion is highly, highly limited. To call this an emergency so that he can override existing tariffs is a very dangerous precedent. This is a power of Congress to tax us. We should jealously guard the exclusive authority of Congress to pass and create taxes. In fact, they're very strict in the Constitution. It says that all bills generating revenue must originate in the House of Representatives. So it has to be in the people's house from which this any new tax or increase in tax. And of course, Mr. Trump is just flat factually wrong. A tariff is a tax on Americans. And he talks about collecting all this revenue from tariffs, but he only no dime of that is collected on anybody but Americans, and only insofar as they actually do buy foreign goods. So it is a tax, and being a tax, it should be exclusively and strictly regarded as the power of Congress. This is one of those instances where I would say we have to read very, very narrowly the grant of powers. That is implied by Articles, the Amendments 9 and 10 of the Bill of Rights, but also the simple rules of interpreting a legal language. And more than that, the separation of powers doctrine that Madison and the framers were so keen on, and indeed the very reason why America had its revolution: no taxation without representation. And by that we mean Congress.
Indeed, and the taxation at the time was something like 1%. Imagine how inflamed the colonial people would be to be taxed to the extent we are today. Michael, it looked like you wanted to say something.
I do. And it's interesting because Alan Thomas actually posed the question for Jim that's right in line with what I'm going to say. And that's conservatives, or those on the right. I don't even know what we would call them anymore. They certainly aren't in the tradition of Goldwater or Reagan. Definitely not Edmund Burke. But
forget Madison and Jefferson.
Yeah, but nonetheless, for years they rightly critiqued the idea that Congress delegated the authority to create all these agencies, these executive agencies, to the executive. They were right that Congress gave up its lawful authority and they have no right to do so. But now they would turn around and argue in relation to tariffs. Oh, but they've given the president this authority. It's not an authority they can give. The Constitution doesn't give them that. And in line with that, Alan Thomas has a question for Jim. He says, Jim, would you roll back the War Powers Act, which is a similar situation where Congress is the only entity authorized by the Constitution to declare war, but they give some of that power to the president. He doesn't call it a declared war. He just launches attacks. So, Jim, what do you think about what I've said, and how about Alan Thomas's question about the War Powers Act?
Well, I think that it's important. The way we have to interpret the Constitution is to take every word, every comma seriously, and interpret each sentence and clause in light of all the others. So, for example, in Article 4, where it talks about the role of the states, it does say that governor of a state, upon invasion or insurrection, can apply to the federal government, help, help. And under those emergency situations of an actual invasion, not like the pseudo invasion that Trump is calling immigration, but when it's a real violent invasion or insurrection, a president does have a degree of emergency power. Now, where does that cut off? I read Section 8, Article 1, the power to declare war pretty narrowly, but in light of those other clauses. The president is commander in chief of the military in Article 2. And so he does have a plenary power to supervise the military, no question about it. But there should be a running clock. We should be looking at our watch, even if there is an invasion, even if there is a military emergency to which the president is responding and has to respond because Congress hasn't had time to get its act together. I think it should be a very narrow window. And that can be, in my view, defined by statute. I think that the parameters of that statute should be reviewable by the Supreme Court. But the War Powers Act itself is a violation of the declaration of war power granted to Congress. I fully agree with that. It is too loose. It is too wide and broad. In the wake of 9/11, for example, the kind of power that was granted to George W. Bush was absurdly broad and in my view, a total violation of the power granted to Congress. You can, for an indefinite period of time, against any group, as long as it's terrorism, you go after terrorism, Mr. Bush, as you think appropriate, and there's really no time limit on it. Now, you do have to notify us. Now, wait, hold the phone. There's nothing about notify us, in 30 days, and suddenly we've got a war on our hands. No, we should require, just as we require Congress to create or increase taxes, we should require Congress to declare war, or the president's power simply terminates to engage in military action.
What a great answer. Is it any wonder we had this guy on?
I'm curious. I've read the newspaper that there are some Republicans who are attempting to push back, or who desire to push back against President Trump, but they're afraid of retaliation, political retaliation. How do we get these legislators to seize back the power of the purse and to limit the power of the presidency to what it should be? And there might be the political will on the left, since their guy isn't in office.
Yeah.
And
that's the way it always.
And we have those dissenters on the right.
Well, bless those dissenters on the right. They are acting with great courage, but you'll notice how they get picked off and destroyed and smeared, on the pages of, right-wing magazines and right-wing newspapers and Fox News. And so the instant McConnell says no to something, okay, McConnell is, this old doddering old man, ... And so anyone who stands up to Trump will threaten to primary them. And so it takes a great deal of courage. This is why it's better to have at least one House of Congress in the other party, so that something can be done and you can get some kind of debate going. For years, it was the left that created this monstrously powerful president. Under FDR, they created all of these agencies that completely violate the separation of powers. Something like it wasn't until the 1970s under Nixon that we got the EPA. But think of the EPA. They make the rule, they make the law, they enforce the law, and they adjudicate the meaning of the law. And that is a total violation of separation of powers, something Congress ought not to be even able to do. But it was the left who wanted all these regulatory agencies and administrative agencies to have this power. The Supreme Court had to wrestle with this in the 1950s, and they came up with all kinds of complex, really Byzantine, complex rules about when the Congress can do that and when an agency can do that and what the limits on that, if there are such limits. And it's the left who were always saying, no, give the power to the administrative agency. They opposed the overturning of the Chevron rule. So in other words, if there's any ambiguity, EPA can define its own authority. Well, Congress never gave you the authority to regulate, say, carbon emissions. So why the heck can you, EPA, suddenly say, oh, no, we now have the power to regulate carbon emissions without any authorization from Congress? Well, it was vague, and so the EPA can decide it. That's the left's position. So the left creates this monster executive this tyrannical executive. And Mr. Trump is simply being an old-fashioned leftist on this. My Republican friends, it is Mr. Trump is acting in ways that you as a Republican were complaining about in the 50s and 60s when Goldwater could be nominated by the Republican Party. The Republicans have thrown out any respect for strict constitutional interpretation of powers, something they once fiercely advocated for. So we are living in a...
Did the conservative movement ever articulate its principles as the conservation of classical liberalism? Was there ever a point in the conservative movement when they did that?
Well, what I would say was interesting is that both parties had a totally different attitude in the 19th century. They knew they were operating within certain limits, say with the Commerce Clause or other clauses of the Constitution. But there was a better time and there were better justices. But you have to go back to practically the 19th century to get decent Supreme Court justices who understand the role of the limited powers of the federal government or individual rights in an expansive way. But as I say, even in the 19th century, they gutted the 14th Amendment right out of the chute, in my view, because they wanted the states to be able to still do, maybe not slavery, but they still wanted them to be able to engage in Jim Crow racial discrimination. They still wanted the states to be able to violate the Establishment of Religion Clause in a variety of ways. And so because of those political considerations, even in the 19th century, you have most justices by the end of the 19th century are simply chucking the idea of classical liberalism, so that you've got Supreme Court justice, saying, Herbert Spencer's social statics is not written into the Constitution. But no, sir, property rights and free enterprise are a part of the Constitution as properly understood from a number of clauses. And as I say, you have to look at each clause in light of all the others.
So, Mark, I would say somebody like a George Will, I believe he stated it explicitly. I'm not positive, but he makes the case for conserving classical liberalism. George Will is somebody that I would consider a conservative. Even when I disagree with him, which I do on many, he's still a thoughtful person. But even going back to the 18th century, Edmund Burke wrote a book called An Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs, in which he made the case, I don't know if he used the word conservative, but his point was that he is actually a Whig, that the things he was advocating was the Whig Party, which was the Liberal Party, and he was trying to maintain that. But Jim said something very interesting a second ago about these agencies that investigate themselves that has dear and deep meaning to me. When I was incarcerated, and Brent McCall and I wrote our book criticizing the system, and correctional officers were retaliating and trying to get me assaulted, I wrote to the state's attorney's office. And I said, look, these guys are trying to get me beat up. I have a witness now who will go on the record in state. So, and they responded to me, the Department of Correction will investigate itself. And I just thought, well, Jesus, it's funny that when I got arrested, I wasn't allowed to investigate myself. that is just the most absurd notion that I could possibly hear. But I'll flip it back over to you, Mark, and you can proceed.
I can't imagine anything more terrifying. I just thought William F. Buckley considered the conservative movement to stand astride history and say stop. And that was sort of what became the spirit of conservatism then. It was just to put a halt to the progressive movement. It was an anti-movement as opposed to the pro-movement of keeping classical liberalism alive.
Well, he was, it's interesting because he wasn't a big advocate of and conservatives in the 20th century really weren't advocates of, say, applying the Bill of Rights against the states. They did it through the Due Process Clause, I know, when it wasn't the vehicle meant for it. It was the Privileges and Immunities Clause. But having gutted the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the Supreme Court at least did a good thing in the conclusion of which was good, was to piecemeal, bit by bit, apply the Bill of Rights against the states. Freedom of speech starting in the 20s, freedom of religion in the early 1940s, until by the turn of the 21st century, even the Second Amendment is an individual right to bear arms. Buckley, a student of Albert J. Nock, and he advocated something better than what conservatives do today, but still not what I would regard as true classical liberalism. And there were people on the right who were better back in the 30s and 40s. In fact, the intellectual right almost consisted of a handful of people like Albert J. Nock, H.L. Mencken, Henry Hazlitt. You could almost count them on one hand. Now, those guys, the three guys I just named there, were way better and much more classical liberal than today's conservatives, who are basically old-time Labor Democrats. Labor Democrats, when I was growing up, is basically what Trump and Trumpism and the Republican Party has become today.
Jim, you left out Isabel Patterson, but
yeah, Isabel Patterson.
No, but that's actually what I want to ask you about is if you could just tell us a little bit about the great Albert J. Nock. Although, basically an anarchist, and I'm sure that we'd all have very big differences with him. What an amazing mind, right?
What an amazing mind. And he very much was an admirer of Isabel Patterson and Rose Wilder Lane. He said those were the only two political commentators, as far as he was concerned, that made any sense, whatever. And of course, the great journalist John Chamberlain, who wrote most of the editorials for Time Life magazines in the 1940s, he said it wasn't some Austrian economist who converted him to classical liberalism. It was the three Furies, Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand, who all came out with important books in 1943, which sort of set the agenda for classical liberals in America thereafter, giving voice to what was the implicit founding philosophy of the United States and what made America so great. But Albert J. Nock is absolutely worth a read. Memoirs of a Superfluous Man should be required reading for every high school student. If you want to read something fun and insightful, read H.L. Mencken, the Sage of Baltimore. But, so much of the right has been economic focused. You take someone like the former communist Max Eastman. You played Max Eastman in a film, didn't you, Mark?
I did.
Pick someone like
did.
Where?
Hemingway and Gellhorn. He was a bit player in Hemingway's life, and they don't. I got to tell you, the film was directed by the great Philip Kaufman, who has a degree in history from the University of Chicago, and I don't think he liked Eastman very much because Eastman became a convert. I mean, he was literally one of the co-founders of the ACLU. He was a card-carrying communist. Went to Moscow, came back, and said, "Screw this! I am not a commie anymore." And so in the Hemingway and Gellhorn series, he just comes off as a bit of a buffoon and a guy that Hemingway sort of puts.
Yeah, that's too bad because he was a courageous guy but he was converted, you see, by Austrian. He became a friend of Hayek and Mises. He was converted by economic arguments, and he didn't call himself a libertarian. He called himself a radical conservative by the 1950s, and wrote a small book called Reflections on the Failure of Socialism. For example, he opposed the Vietnam War. He was a lifelong atheist, and yet he was friendly with William Buckley until he thought National Review was too Christian, and he broke off with William Buckley. But talk about a real dyed-in-the-wool communist. He was the editor of The Masses. He actually went to jail for being a communist in the years following World War I.
And talk about courage too. Talk about courage, because stood alone against a communist onslaught too, and against an intellectual onslaught. And in the present day, when we did Hemingway and Gellhorn, he wasn't painted in the best light, and that's unfortunately a historical legacy.
In Reds, the movie with Warren Beatty, is Max Eastman, and of course Edward Harriman plays him, and he's kind of this glasses nebbish guy, whereas Warren Beatty plays Jack Reed. When in history it was exactly the opposite. The sexy lady killer was Max Eastman, and it was Jack Reed who was the kind of glasses wearing nebbish who died. They both men went to the Soviet Union to see what was going on. Jack Reed never, he died there, and he's the only American buried in the Kremlin. But Max Eastman smuggled out Lenin's testament, was a friend of Leon Trotsky's to the time he was assassinated with an ice pick in Mexico by Joseph Stalin. But you see, there was a time in the 40s and 50s where Ayn Rand herself could be friendly with these people. No, they were not objectivists, but those were her friends, people like Henry Hazlitt, John Chamberlain. She even knew Max Eastman. But today, that kind of conservatism, I think is the general point, is dead as a doornail.
Dead.
We need a new party, perhaps.
Well, yes, the American Capitalist
Speaking
Party.
of
He's
that,
learning. Listen to the segue, Jim. I got to ask you something.
wait. I have to take advantage of the segue. Don't
Okay,
forget.
no, yeah, you do. I
Yeah,
screwed up the whole segue.
Speaking of a new party, there is a new party out there. It's called the American Capitalist Party, and all you have to do is go to AmericanCapitalistParty.org, join, donate, become a member, and become of the wave of the future, the new liberal wave of the future. That's right. All right, go ahead.
So, Jim, the other day, and this has nothing to do with why you're here, but nonetheless, we can improvise. The other day, I'm scrolling through Twitter, and this Josie, the redheaded libertarian, she calls herself, who is making arguments for why all these Trumpian orders against immigrants are correct, are good. And she claims to be a libertarian, whatever. She then says that she is the most influential female libertarian ever.
Oh, come on.
Right?
Are you kidding me?
No, so hold on. So she does try to slide in the loophole and say, well, Ayn Rand hated libertarians. Fine. Never mind the fact that there would be no libertarian movement if it wasn't for Ayn Rand. But what about Rose Wilder Lane and Isabel Patterson?
Right. Rose Wilder Lane called herself a libertarian. Now, I don't call myself a libertarian, so I might be happy to give her that moniker. But that's because of what the Libertarian Party started out as, and it's even just gotten worse. When you see these libertarians who are all for Trump-style immigration restrictions, and they don't like Israel, and when I have to hold my nose to just read a lot of the contemporary libertarians. They are not a valid alternative, nor in my view are they really faithful to the founding ideas of America, to the Constitution of the United States, which the three great ladies that we just cited there were. They were very concerned about returning America, in the wake of the New Deal, returning America to a semblance of what James Madison had in mind when they were writing the Constitution.
Can we just agree that Isabella Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand are the second generation founding fathers? We can call them founding mothers, but I think they would appreciate the founding fathers designation as well.
Rand would.
Rand would. Well, yeah, maybe. But also I'd also like to add Frederick Douglass to that mix, because I think he kept the American conscience clearly in sight without losing the integrity of the founding fathers and the founding documents. He tried to hold America accountable to the promises that they made the American people, and to me, he was also part of a second founding generation. What do you say to that, James? Or am I just talking out my capitalist bum?
No, I absolutely agree. And isn't it fascinating that someone like Frederick Douglass, a man who had been a slave, was a brilliant articulator of America's founding ideals and defender of the Declaration and the Bill of Rights in a way that you didn't find from most white leftists or rightists. Unfortunately, through the course of the 19th century, philosophy became increasingly statist, increasingly socialist, until it gets to the point where the Supreme Court can simply abandon any original meaning to, say, the Commerce Clause. And so this constitutional crisis that we're living in has been the product of decades, over a century, of Supreme Court malfeasance when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. There's no question about it. In my mind, we have strayed so far from the original meaning of the Constitution. They have taken it out of context, twisted it, garbled it based on contemporary political ideas. Well, this is no longer convenient for us, or ideas about this have changed. Well, that's not the way to interpret the Constitution at all. If you want to change the Constitution, if you want to expand the government's power to regulate commerce, Supremes, you need a constitutional amendment. And your whimsical changes of opinion from decade to decade, which always seem to be going in one direction, more and more and more government power, is a corruption epistemologically, that is to say, just in terms of understanding what the Constitution's role is. So we almost get to the point where you can say, just, well, if you're going to keep scratching out phrases from the Constitution, you might as well just toss it out and tell us from scratch, Supreme Court, what you think ought to be the case, which is pretty much the case. My constitutional law professor, the great late Bernard Segan, may he rest in peace, wrote a book called The Supreme Court's Constitution, in which he really demonstrates this to be the case. The Supreme Court has effectively chucked the language of the Constitution, alas.
Okay, so Mark,
Yes.
I'm just going to say this. You've let this whole thing get away from us. You
What?
did this the other day when I was
No.
debating Jim. You let Jim run wild all over me. It was like a 2-on-1 debate. You got to get back to get back to the articles.
Just as I was about to go back to the articles, but this is a digression I think everybody needs to hear. It's not just a diversion. This is a digression that everybody needs to hear.
Jim, do you know the building behind me? Do you know what that is?
I cannot recognize it.
That is Carpenter's Hall.
Oh,
Okay, thank God.
yeah.
Another knowledgeable person didn't know that was Carpenter's Hall.
Yeah, well, it's, we've got a big head there. We've got such a giant brain there.
And a massive microphone in front of it. It's blocking.
A massive microphone. A big brain with a
Impossible to tell what it
microphone in front of him. Yeah,
But before we go on to the next article, the next constitutional travesty that is about to hit us, I just wanted to shout out Bonnie Bertrand's compliment to you, James, which is, it's not that James knows so many historical details, is that he integrates them, a priceless asset anywhere.
Where's that? Why can't I see that?
That's because you have...
Oh, there it is. Okay. I'm scrolling down.
Moment. You're in adversarial mode, so you didn't see it. No, I'm kidding. So the next article comes from Reason Magazine, and it relates to the order, the midnight order that was leveled against the Trump administration to cease and desist, basically, using the Aliens Enemies Act to carry out new batches of deportations. Of course, 7 justices agreed with this, and 2 dissented, thinking that we needed a little bit more time to see that Trump would abide by the original orders to cease and desist. So, what do you think of this this order, this midnight order? It apparently is a very rare thing for the Supreme Court to issue. I love that a couple of Trump appointees were actually on the right side, which is they don't trust the administration to abide by the law and abide by the court's rulings, and so are issuing this in lieu of that. So, what say you to this?
Well, I think this is as much a psychological impact of the way Trump handled the Abrego Garcia case as anything else. Truly, I think that more of the conservative justices might have been on his side on this had Trump not, let's go through it. First, they had a deportation order that said, yeah, he's deportable. And yeah, we have reason to believe that he's MS-13, although the due process there is insufficiently due as far as I'm concerned, but let's leave that aside. The order itself, the deportation order they used to deport him, said, do not send him back to El Salvador. And the Trump administration completely made a mistake, as they admitted in court. Okay, we screwed up. But now the Trump administration says, oh, no, we didn't screw up at all, and we're not going to lift a finger to bring him back. So doing the habeas petition in federal district court, the judge said, you have to effectuate and facilitate his return. Now, the Supreme Court, when it went to the Supreme Court on appeal, they said, yeah, effectuate is a little too strong. The president does have, you can't make the president go to war with El Salvador to get someone back, in effect. President is in control of foreign policy, and the guy is in a foreign country, so we overturn the effectuate part, but we uphold the facilitate part. Now, as Professor Jonathan Turley correctly pointed out, what the hell does that mean? We weren't given much guidance on what facilitate means. On the other hand, did Trump lift a goddamn finger? Did he do anything that might be construed as facilitate? No. He said, I'm not going to do a goddamn thing to even facilitate this guy's return. So he was thumbing his nose first at the original deportation judge, and then secondly at the Supreme Court. And so I think the Supreme Court is irritated at the president. And I think that that, as much as anything, explains why they said, okay, we're not deciding things on the merits there yet, but hold the phone. Don't deport under the the Enemies Act until we have a chance to review this. Now, it is true that many presidents have used the Alien Enemies Act many times in a dubious way. My God, federal law has been used so egregiously, and this, again, the Supreme Court has gone along. Think of it, for example, the Karamazov case. During World War II, FDR rounded up Japanese Americans. My 8th grade science teacher grew up for a few years of his childhood in Manzanar, one of the California detention concentration camps. Now, they weren't like Nazi concentration camps, but they had to sell their property, and they were rounded up simply because they were Japanese. Did the Supreme Court push back on FDR? No, the Supreme Court upheld that. That's the kind of crap that the Supreme Court has upheld. So it is true, lady and gentlemen justices up there, that Trump may be violating due process right now, and they may be upsetting you, but you all have been setting a horrific set of precedents for presidents to be able to do whatever they like in this department. Obama, when Obama deported 3 million people, do you think all of them got the process that was due? No. 3 million cases are not cases where I think there was sufficient due process. Did Joe Biden ignore existing immigration law? I don't like existing immigration law, but you say, President Trump, you're ignoring it. That does not change the fact that Trump is ignoring court orders, ignoring, in this case now, the Supreme Court when it says facilitate. So the Supreme Court has plenty of reason, it seems to me, to put what Trump is doing on hold.
So what happens? What happens, Jim, if he does not abide by the court order? Because the claims by the administration were that they have no further plans to deport people. But then there's that that Trumpian other message, that mixed message being sent out that they were planning flights out as soon as Saturday. Mm-hmm. So what happens if they violate this court order? What's the options open?
I must say that Trump has been relatively careful. That's why I mentioned the Abrego Garcia case. Trump has been relatively careful to abide by at least Supreme Court decisions. In the Abrego Garcia case, he seems to have completely ignored even that facilitate part, as vague as facilitate might be at this stage. So if he ignores the Supreme Court's rulings, we are in a real constitutional crisis. Again,
and what does that mean? What is that when we're in a constitutional crisis? What does that mean? How is that resolved?
Well, the Supreme Court can do some stuff, but look, one of the remarkable things about America is that the founding fathers gave the power of the purse to Congress. They're in charge of the ka-ching money. They gave the power of the military to the president. He's got the cops, he's got the army, he's got the guns. And here we've got a group of 9 old lawyers in black robes who have effectively no power. The only authority they have comes from the fact that everyone just sort of submits to what they say. Whether we like what the Supreme Court says or not, everyone says, well, they have the final jurisdiction over cases and controversies that arise under this Constitution. And so everyone just has obeyed them, whether they like it or not. Now, we've seen increasingly presidents sort of ignore it. We saw, for example, Biden in the teeth of a Supreme Court ruling that said you can't just forgive student loans. You can't just spend billions and billions of dollars without the authorization of Congress. And he kept trying to find ways around it. Now, but even Biden didn't ignore that order. He was trying different ways to get around the Supreme Court. But in other words, the snowball may have started out small, but it has been rolling bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it comes to a point where we've come to a point where if Trump simply ignores the Supreme Court ruling, what can be done? All we can do is elect new people and hope that they return it to some sanity. But as I say, he's been somewhat careful until now, at least, about trying to comply with Supreme Court orders. And he keeps saying, I will obey the Supreme Court when they have an order. And one could say that the Abrego Garcia case, it wasn't a very clear order, Nonetheless, he clearly violated it because the spirit of it, because he didn't lift, as I say, a goddamn finger to do anything to facilitate. He didn't even offer an airplane. Well, you know, if you let me take him back, we'll pay for the plane. We'll hold him in custody so you can have a bigger hearing. He didn't even make an offer. He didn't do a single thing to facilitate the man's return to get appropriate due process. So what do we do if a president just thumbs his nose or flashes the bird at the Supreme Court?
And given the fact that we're paying for those people to be incarcerated, he does have a considerable amount of power to say, return this one person, even though they're making like they don't.
Of course he did. And of course the president of El Salvador would return him if he was asked. He wants to stay in good graces with Mr. Trump so he can get all these prisoners into his super prison down there where people just disappear. You know, and the debate over this is just despicable on both sides. Absolutely despicable. The right doesn't give a crap about due process. And so they go on a personal attack on the guy. Oh, well, there was this allegation of wife beating. Oh, well, you know, there was this other allegation. Oh, well, you know, well, that stuff wasn't even part of the due process, any of the deportation hearings that he had before. And what does the left do? The left just says, does the exact mirror opposite. This guy is a beloved Maryland father, da, da, da. But due process has nothing to do with the moral condition or status of the person in question. I know he was a citizen, but again, the 14th Amendment says you have due process rights whether you're a citizen or not. All persons get it. Charles Manson got a jury trial. The issue is not the moral, my moral judgment of Mr. Abrego Garcia. It is a threat to everyone. It is a threat to everyone when anyone's due process rights are being ignored or violated. And so the nature of the debate itself, I find very distressing. Rather than being focused on legal rights and the nature of our immigration laws and the reforms that are needed. I mean, just our existing immigration laws, in my view, are immoral. But
James, that requires conceptual integration. That's difficult. So both sides are appealing to emotion. That's so much easier. Before we go on to the next article, because I know Michael's going to be pushing me to the next article here, I had to.
Oh, don't make accusations. I wasn't pushing. I was willing to let the man talk. I'm very judicious and polite in that regard. I don't know what you're talking about.
Your face is an open book. I can see every thought that passes.
No, actually, I'm just a wreck here because I initially forgot to. There's so much going on with technology, and I don't know what I'm doing anyway. But I've developed a thing where I can plug the computer directly into the internet, and that's supposed to stop the interference that we were getting. That's why I walked away, because I noticed I forgot to plug it in. And then even after I plugged it in, stuff was still going haywire, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. That's probably what you're seeing.
I'm glad I didn't notice any of it. But before we move on to the next article, I have to address what Chandler said with respect to the Japanese internment. Which also during World War I, if I'm not mistaken, Woodrow Wilson didn't treat the German folks too well either. He said, well, the U.S. was at war with Japan. Does that excuse interning over 100,000 Japanese people in camps, stealing their property and holding them prisoner for the duration of the war?
No. Just because they're Japanese, most of those people were very loyal to the United States, had left Japan for a reason. If they were still these worshippers of a divine emperor, why wouldn't they stay in Japan? No, they came to America, and they came to America for a reason. And most of them were good, loyal Americans. And in fact, some of them were veterans. There was a distinct unit of very brave Japanese fighters during World War. Woodrow Wilson during World War I. That man was, just a flat, straight up racist. He segregated the U.S. Army.
And Washington, D.C.
No, he was a huge advocate of, as former governor of New Jersey, former president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson was just a rank racist and was a dear friend of segregation.
And screened "Birth of a Nation" at the White House, which is one of the most racist
Well, I mean, path-breaking film, no doubt. I mean, one of the films that created the modern movie as we know it, no
Narrative, yeah,
doubt
the
it.
narrative.
But it was totally racist. It totally was sympathetic to the KKK, no doubt about it. And so,
Although some might say the Great Train Robbery was arguably the first narrative film.
narrative,
He certainly did a more long form version of filmmaking
yeah.
and nice filmmaking, but I mean, it was still a an apologetics for the Confederacy and for the Ku Klux Klan.
Right. Well, you can be a great filmmaker and still be a racist. And D.W. Griffith kind of proves that, doesn't he? I mean, he made some really great films with Lillian Gish and so forth. I mean, really marvelous early films, but the man was a racist. And you can't make a film like that without having your sympathies in exactly the wrong place.
So I guess there was a symposium recently where a bunch of people from disparate political perspectives got together and they asked themselves the question: is Trump breaking the law? And there was a large consensus from people on the left, people on the right, libertarians, all across the board, various intellectuals, agreed that he sort of was. And the excerpt from the author of the article's contribution to the event says this: the second Trump administration is trying to undermine the Constitution on so many levels that it's hard to keep track. But three are particularly dangerous. Now, we've been talking about these: usurpations of Congress spending power, unconstitutional measures against immigration justified by bogus claims that the U.S. is under invasion, in quotes, scare quotes, as they should be, and assertions of virtually limitless presidential power to impose tariffs. Now, who could disagree with that except, I don't know, Greg Gutfeld or Jesse Waters? But truly, we are in the midst of a very strange phenomenon. It's not quite unprecedented, but it sort of is too. It's not that presidents haven't abused their power in the past. We've seen it over the decades, but this is so egregious. It's so egregious.
Presidents push the envelope, and the direction the presidents have been pushing the envelope is in the wrong direction. And very frequently, the Supreme Court has given the president the green light when they push the envelope of governmental or presidential power. And so Mr. Trump didn't invent pushing the envelope against the Constitution, but there's no question he's pushing the envelope against the Constitution and in the direction of authoritarianism. And the instances cited by these professors, and these are legal authorities, by the way, in this article, which I recommend people take a look at, all of them, whether I agree with them on particular issues or not, all of them are serious legal scholars who should be taken seriously and have well thought out opinions. The president does not have unlimited powers when it comes to spending or tariffs. And when you invoke emergency powers, that is the age-old excuse for the authoritarian. It is war that we were just talking about the Japanese internment. It is war that so frequently creates this new government power, new government authority that encroaches on individual rights. And then when the war is all over, suddenly we're in this new world where the president and the government just simply have more power, and we have to live with it.
So it's not unusual that the administration is using the language of war, invasions, so forth, in order to acquire more power.
Talk about abusing concepts.
Mm-hmm.
When the Constitution talks about invasion or insurrection, they mean military force being used. Now, I know millions of people came into the country illegally under Biden, under what is our law today, but they weren't starting a war. And it's funny too, because they look at they'll use the right will use the sympathy of, well, why don't you care about Laken Riley, who was killed by a illegal immigrant? Well, there's a few things to say about that. Laken Riley's killer had been released up in New York. So it's the New York law enforcement officials who let him get away with crap, and to be out of jail at all, and I was sympathetic to Laken Riley. But wait a minute here. Is it really an emergency? Has crime gone up because we now have, Trump says 21 million. Let's say it's only 11 million illegal immigrants who came in under Joe Biden. You would have thunk, because he says, gosh, a huge percentage of these people are criminals. Well, that should have shot the crime rate through the roof, right? No. most of these illegal aliens are otherwise perfectly peaceful, law-abiding people. There is no crisis when it comes to violence because of these illegal immigrants. I have all the sympathy in the world for those victims of crimes by illegal aliens. But when I start talking about Abrego Garcia, and then you bring up Laken Riley, it's like you're creating this giant distraction, another separate issue, as if I
Again,
didn't have
an
sympathy
appeal to
for.
emotion to avoid the conceptual connections that you have to make, right? To show that they're being inconsistent. Listen, also, the fact that President Trump has outwardly claimed that he's considering building more prisons in El Salvador for United States citizens, of course, only violent criminals.
Of course.
Of course, only
The
violent.
worst of the worst.
Those are the worst, and they need to be disappeared to some other country. But of course, when one sees his emotional reaction and hyperbole to people who dissent from his opinion, and his childish desire for revenge, one has to wonder who becomes a criminal and who becomes violent, and under what circumstances. Now, what standard are we using? Eric Clayton says something that sort of rings true to me. How long before they start putting us capitalist, objectivist individualists in those out-of-country prisons and concentration camps? I mean, that's something seriously to be considered. If they violate the due process of one guy because he's unpopular and they've created a case against him in the public image to make him look bad, well, then they can do the same to us.
And if you're out of the country and outside of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction, would it matter whether you were a citizen or not? Wouldn't the Supreme Court have to say, well, we can't force the president to do anything diplomatically or declare war? The citizen is just gone. Now, I myself believe that the Supreme Court, I pray to God, but my own fair assessment of the Supreme Court is they would not permit U.S. citizens to be sent, even if they were convicted of the worst crimes you can possibly imagine.
But this administration seems to put them on jets and toss them off before the Supreme Court can come to those decisions.
There are citizens being detained. There were German tourists who were detained in Hawaii. There was a guy from New Mexico, just because he was in Arizona, who was a citizen of the United States, detained for 10 days because he didn't have his papers with him. What kind of Nazi Germany are we living in? Where just because you're Hispanic and in a border state, they can detain you for 10 days because you don't have your papers on you. No, that's really bad. And I'd remind my concern, I was a prosecutor for almost 18 years. And believe me, the one of the big problems that I had to deal with were the fact that aliens who were here illegally would not report crimes to the police. When we did have crime reported to the police, they were afraid to come back to court because they were afraid of being deported. I can't count on both hands the number of times I had to get practically on my hands and knees, begging an illegal alien, no. We have to stop this monster criminal. The criminal was a citizen, by the way. And I had to get on my hands and knees practically to beg these aliens, no. I will make sure that you will not get deported. I will make sure the immigration authorities, we called it the INS back then, and then it was called ICE. I promise you I won't call immigration authorities on you. We need you to help stop this vicious criminal. And think of all the conservatives can point to Laken Riley all they like, but there are murder and rape cases, sexual assault cases, child molest cases, you name it, cases that disappear, don't get prosecuted, the criminal gets away with it. Why? Because the illegal alien was afraid to even report it to the police. Crimes against illegal aliens go completely underreported. And conservatives, does that bother them? These law and order conservatives? No. They've got their big flashy, centerpiece cases that they want to trot out every time, even if it has nothing to do with Mr. Abrego Garcia or nothing to do with the case that we're talking about here.
And it also seems to me like the rise in assaults and violent crimes that are taking place in cities like New York and in the subways of New York in particular are not necessarily illegal immigrants, even though the one case of setting that woman on fire has made headlines all over the place, and they try to use him as an avatar for the type of person that comes over here illegally. It's mostly mentally ill people and drug addicts and American citizens who are committing these crimes against other Americans. That's the vast majority of the case.
Mostly. In fact, the odds are that if you're an immigrant, illegal or legal, you are less likely to commit a felony than a citizen is. That's right, folks. Citizens are more likely to commit felonies than immigrants, whether legal or illegal. So when he declares this emergency, based on a few, really strong cases. Now, don't get me wrong. You mentioned the subway case where the person was lit on fire. Even in my ideal world, criminal aliens would be deportable. Of course, criminal aliens should be deportable. And part of the problem is the fact that Biden didn't vet people at the border. There is no power, getting back to the Constitution, there is no power for the federal government to regulate immigration.
Jim knew I was coming. Jim knew it. When he said Biden didn't stop him, he knew I was on my way.
But Biden didn't claim that it was outside the power.
No, he did not.
Did he?
No.
And I would, as I've said to you before, if necessary, advocate a constitutional amendment to allow us to screen for terrorists and criminals and people carrying deadly infectious diseases from coming.
I would support that as well, by the way.
Then I think that's rational. I think that's rational. But we only have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to get into something you alluded to, Jim. Okay, and this comes from an article in the New York Post about the German teens. Traveling to the U.S., they were jailed and booted for loosely planning vacation deemed suspicious. Now, this is scary as hell. I mean, these kids come over here after their high school graduation. They want to tour the United States, and already tourism is going down because of Trump's unilateral war against the world. New York tourism is down, and here are these kids wanting to enjoy the wonderful landscapes and great things that America has to offer, and they are stopped in Honolulu, strip searched. All of their stuff is gone through, and they are held prisoner there for a time, and then asked to leave because they didn't plan their entire stay.
Yeah,
they didn't pre-book a hotel.
I mean, most Americans will pre-book the hotel and know their itinerary. But you know something? There is nothing more fun. And the first time I went to Europe, I left open-ended some of the stuff. Look, this is going to might be fun, and this might be something I want to be flexible in my time about. No, just because you didn't pre-book everything. They said, well, we're going to go to Hawaii, then California, then to Costa Rica. And they were perfectly innocent. They're not criminals. They were just young people, tourists here. But can you blame them, as you say? I wouldn't blame a foreigner at all from not coming to the United States, even to visit beautiful places like Hawaii and California. Could you feel safe here? Would you feel safe as a foreigner in the United States, whether you have a visa, a green card, or just a passport and being a tourist here?
And particularly if your skin is not white.
Yes, obviously Hispanic.
I would be
Arabs
seems to be a criteria for automatic deportation in some of these people's minds.
I don't blame them for being scared.
No, my housekeeper's friends her friends' children are terrified for their mother to go out now and pick them up from school because they're afraid ICE officials are waiting outside the school and will grab her up and deport her, and that they will be alone. And so my housekeeper has to go pick up the children from school because of the fear that these kids feel. Now, this isn't an irrational fear. This is happening across the. We're not exaggerating. We're not the Trump administration. We're telling you guys the truth, so that you guys can start thinking for yourselves and decoupling from this administration as quickly as possible. Decoupling your minds, you Trump derangement syndrome folks on the right, you need to decouple from Trump because he's no good. He's no good for the country at the moment, guys.
Any criticism of Trump is Trump derangement syndrome. Yeah. And I don't care who you voted for last time because, it's a tough call and, wow, how do I choose between this idiot and that idiot? I'm not going to. But when you got one of those idiots, everything he does that's wrong, you have to call out. There's no question about it. And simply calling out Trump for doing something bad, like on tariffs, mean, my God, who possibly, with any kind of background with with economics or classical liberalism, can support Trump in his tariff policy? No. And the minute I even whisper a criticism of Trump's tariff policy, suddenly I'm Trump derangement syndrome. You're crazy, Jim. How dare you criticize the president? No, I'm going to criticize the guy in power every time he does something that I don't like.
Yeah, it's
And
a wonderful
unfortunately,
thing.
both sides have been converging in the direction of fascism.
It's a wonderful thing that the citizen of his country can criticize the most powerful man in the country. It's a wonderful thing. It's something that we should keep, that we should hold on to and hold dear, because it means we're free.
Yes, that's the most basic of our liberties. To criticize the dude in power is the most basic of our liberties. Now, I'm not saying that criticizing me is censorship, but I'm saying, look, you guys have to get over it. I mean, just because I criticize the guy on something doesn't mean that I'm Trump deranged or Trump psychotic. Sounds like you're Trump psychotic.
Indeed, if your criticism is rational, they should check their premises. So I think we're coming to the conclusion of the show. As much as I'd like to continue and can talk to Jim forever and ever and ever and ever, and to listen to Jim forever and ever and ever and ever, I think we have to come to the conclusion of the show. Now, Michael, whose turn is it for the?
It's yours. It's your turn. I was going to put it on Jim and say, and just Jim, go. You got to do it today. But I think that would be unfair. Although we did break news with Jim Valliant coming out as a theist and praying to God that the Supreme Court would make the right decision. I think that's enough. So I think it's you. You have to give the capitalist thought of the day.
Okay. Well, so capitalism, folks, is a system of economic freedom. It is grounded in individual rights, and that requires a certain kind of political system to be in place, a political system that restrains force and bans it from all human interactions. And that's what the government is supposed to do, restrain force. It is a force regulator. And we have a constitution in place so that the force of government itself, which has historically been known to express its force rather indelicately in all directions, is restrained by explicit rules that it cannot ever violate. And those explicit rules stand as stalwart protectors of your individual rights. What we are seeing today in the administration is a violation of those explicit rules and a violation of your individual rights. And now, just because they are pointed at the unpopular person doesn't mean they will not eventually be pointed at you. So jealously guard your Constitution. Jealously guard its explicit interpretation. Jealously guard the restraint of force from government, so that your liberties will live on, because liberty is the greatest innovation since the domestication of fire. All right, that's my capitalist thought for the day.
Nice.
Nice.
All right, everybody, we'll be back again tomorrow, same time, same place.
See you later, guys.
Thank you.